Women's fashion clothing. There is a certain number of various pieces of clothing around the world today, and because of the request of clothing in the global market, there is a certain number of people who were successful in the businesses of clothing and sale of the products that people will buy. When you consider all the fashion apparel shops, which take place around where you live, it becomes rather easy to see that clothing is a very large industry on the international stage. All the times that you have a very large industry, there are always smaller markets of place than people can fill. These markets of place become thereafter secondary divisions of larger industry in order to make them the feeling of place supplied with. There are a certain number of various manners that the industry of the clothes industry could be subdivided, and one in the manners, which occurs, is by the kind. There are a certain number of various companies, which supply with the clothing of lie, and a certain number of various companies, which supply with the women fashion clothing in the world today. Women's fashion clothing. The women fashion clothing was around for very in the long run as its own secondary category in larger industry of clothing, but even the women fashion clothing itself is a very broad category. A person can discuss women fashion clothing while it is connected to the tops, in this case the things like shirts, bras, knitting, and a certain number of other articles of clothing inherited to play. It also will have division between clothing with the mode and the clothing which is strictly functional, and some share between the two. There will be also information on the women fashion clothing as it is connected to the formal occasions. It is a subcategory of women fashion clothing, and there is a certain number of others, which represent all the various pieces of clothing that the women will purchase. Designer fashion apparel. The use of designer fashion apparel is perhaps one of the hottest industries in the world today. If you are interested by obtaining clothing for personal use, or alternatively to make a study on the people which buy the designer fashion apparel, hundreds of choices are available in the market. The women fashion clothing of research is something very abstract rather than solid. When you describe something of with the mode or a specific category of the jewels, it becomes much easier to have this discussion because such are the very static objects. The women fashion clothing, however, changes year by year and even varies by seasons and countries, cultural influences of the area. Other fashion industry. There are contemporary fashion, conventional fashion, modern fashion, trendy fashions, and a certain number of other fashion which lead to a certain number of other appearances that the women can cause by buying the good kind of women fashion clothing. People may think that the world of fashion caters only to women's interests and needs. But what others may not know is that businesses in the fashion industry are seriously competing with one another when it comes to children's apparel and men's clothing.